Thank you. It's really nice to be here, and thanks so much for the kind introduction. So you've already heard about TREDS. We are a large group, and I just want to acknowledge that my team contributes to all the work that we do, and my co-director, Dr. Ryan Moran, is the co-PI on many of the projects. In our previous experience at TREDS with naturalistic driving studies was with the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety Long Road Study, which was one of the largest older driver prospective naturalistic studies done in the world. 3,000 older drivers agreed to have their car instrumented for 5 years and have every move that they made recorded and reported anonymously, well, not anonymously, actually, to back to the researchers. For that study, we had used a device called Danlaw that people kept in their car, and that worked for about 2.5 years. It was too expensive for us to continue, and we moved to a phone app where we were able to collect the driving data that way. So that had been my experience to date with naturalistic driving until we started these two studies, which we started a year ago, and I'm going to present. The studies are a little messy. I want to warn you that working with two companies who are not research oriented and trying to make sense of the public health implications of the data that they're collecting has been interesting. So I don't need to tell this group that driving safety is a critical public health issue and a leading cause of death in the state and worldwide. But I will say that we've been focusing on commercial motor vehicles because they're such an important component of the roads. They're a critical part of the economy. 73% of goods that are shipped by trucks. And the expression is, if you bought it, a truck brought it. We also saying that 4% of men in the United States work in the trucking industry. It's the largest occupation for men nationally. And the percent of women lags far behind that, but it's rapidly growing. So though CMVs are only 5% of registered vehicles, they're 11% of miles driven. So as many of you know, and we discussed, the more miles you drive, the more you're at risk of crashes. So indeed, CMV crash fatalities are a concern, and fatalities are on the rise. Between 2020, as you can see, and 2022, there was a large increase, although 2020 was a little bit of an odd year. So we all look at this data and go, well, it probably had a huge influence. The other issue around CMVs is that when there is a crash, it's likely another vehicle that is going to hold a fatality because the trucks are so large. It's the smaller vehicle that's going to really get into trouble. So I'm going to talk about this study that we did from a company called DriveWise that has a program, real-time driver alerts. And what we wanted to see was what was happening, how we could use this to study work zone crashes. So again, similar to what I said about the being only 5% of vehicular traffic, but a larger amount of fatal crashes. In work zone crashes, it's a full 30% that are CMVs. You can see that CMV crashes rose modestly, but the percent of involvement in fatal work zone crashes went up even more. So why are these crashes taking place? Well, some of it's what we would expect from passenger vehicles. It's the usual culprits. It's speeding and impairment and distraction, the things that we're all very familiar with. But with CMVs, we also look at issues around size and weight and visibility and their cargo issues. Sometimes the drivers don't have adequate training. And then there's the work zone management. Are they putting up appropriately signage, or is it creating dangerous roadway conditions? So electronic logging devices are in-cab devices that, by law, must track hours of service, but they can also collect a range of data and provide various services to drivers and fleet. Their mandated use has expanded greatly in the past decade. They were mandated for intrastate commercial driving in 2017, and in California, in January of this year, they were mandated within the state. So though they support compliance with HOV regulations, drivers and fleets are experimenting with a range of functions, including monitoring, analyzing, and responding to driving behaviors and sending out custom alert to provide high-value information to drivers. So the goal of our study was to see if we could harness these alerts and reduce work zone crashes. One of the functions that ELD can provide is like pop-up notifications that give drivers notice of upcoming hazards and could mitigate perhaps these CMV crash, the crash problems. So we were encouraged to do this by previous studies that have shown that these alerts will in fact reduce crashes. There was a study out of Cleveland State University where they did congestion alerts and showed a reduction in crashes. And then there was a study out of Purdue that showed the slowdown of CMVs within cab alerts. And then the figure at the bottom is Kentucky State University's driving survey, where they asked the respondents, were they interested in having these alerts and participating in them? And the majority of people said yes. So we asked, would these work zone alerts have a positive benefit? Would we be able to replicate the congestion alerts? What factors would we have to take into account when we were working with work zones that the congestion people didn't have to take into account? And what driver behavior differences could we capture? How could we tell the difference between an in-cab alert and something that was on the side of the road? And were there subgroups for which these alerts were helpful or not? So in our current study, we're funded by FMCSA and in partnership with the company DriveWise that I mentioned, we worked with Caltrans to find out where the work zones were. So it turns out that, as you may know, that Caltrans has a commercial wholesale web portal that's a publicly available data set. So Caltrans has been consulting with us on how to use this, and the DriveWise people can electronically geofence around these work zones once they know where they are, so that when the vehicle is approaching them, they're aware of it and they can implement the alert. So here's a breakdown of our data collection process. All the drivers who are part of this study drive for fleets that have already opted into DriveWise. And they're independent owner-operators or they're fleet owners. And their participation in the study is included in their service agreement with DriveWise. They're already getting alerts, so the drivers aren't surprised or confused when they get other alerts. They're rather familiar with them. So to assess the impact of the alerts on driving behavior, we stratified all of the fleets by size, and then we randomly assigned 75% to get alerts and 25% of them to be suppressed. The vehicle location data starts collecting data 30 seconds before the alert goes out, 1 point per second, and then continues that for 5 minutes after the alert point. So at 500 meters before the work zone, the experimental group gets the pop-up. They see a visual alert on their screen and they hear a chime. The control group doesn't get this, and then the alert disappears after 10 seconds or they can tap it off. So the data we collect are latitude, longitude, and time, and from that we can calculate bearing, speed, acceleration, and deceleration. The data we get is completely anonymous. We don't know who these trucks are, and there's really no potential bad outcomes for the trucks to participate in this. So we were hoping that we would be able to demonstrate that this was indeed a safety feature, and that we're reducing driver's speed before they get to the work zone and reducing hard braking, improving driver perception, and being able to look at whether this kind of alerting technology is beneficial. The alerts that this project is going on for 12 to 14 months. We started in District 11, which you can see is all the way in the lower part of San Diego County at the border. And then we added District 2, which is all the way at the top of California in a very different county, like rural and mountainous. And we're hoping to add a third district in the spring. So we deployed the alerts April 1st and conducted our first batch of analysis on the data through July. So you can see on the graph on the left that we appeared to have a promising pattern that comparing median speeds to try to attenuate the outliers, that it looked like the intervention group, which is shown in orange, had a more immediate and steady reduction in speed once the alert was displayed, indicating that they were paying attention to this. But, and we looked at net acceleration by group, and we found that, in fact, the overall magnitude of slowing for the experimental group was greater than the control group. The alerted drivers also appeared to decelerate about 5 to 10 seconds before the controlled drivers. However, as we began our expanded analysis, we discovered that there was a code error. As I said, real live data is messy. There was a code error that DriveWise had that meant that the control group was only showing up data 10 seconds after the alert and not the 5 minutes that we had hoped to study. So they're trying to fix that, but they, and we still have, as you can see, 6 months of data collection left, but that hasn't happened yet. So in the data I'm going to show you, it only goes out 10 seconds. And if you do the math, the average truck that gets the alert 500 meters before, they're hitting the work zone approximately second 18 to 20, something like that. So one of the other things we noticed was that we had some differences in the alerted group and the control group in terms of the speed with which they were approaching the work zone before any alert went out. So again, we're dealing with many thousands of drivers, but as luck would have it, there's a very small difference in the baseline speed before people reach the place where they get the alert. And we mapped this so you could see that, in fact, the control group, the alerted group on the bottom is going a little bit faster consistently than the control group. So now you have that context regarding our messy data, and you know that why we're restricting our times. I'll show you how we were able to collect data from the groups. So this is the, okay, just the pointer. These are the vehicles with the alert sent, and you can see the kind of volume that we're dealing with. Very large numbers of trucks going through these stops. And these are the trucks that sent us back data. So these trucks got alerted and these trucks sent us back data. So why would we not get data back? Well, it turns out that some of the ELDs are resold, and the company that does the resell blocks the ability of, blocks the ability of the ELD to send the data back. So we lost data from here to here, and we thought, no big deal. But again, we randomly assigned people to be alerted or controlled, but we lost a lot more data in the control group than we did in the alerted group. We don't understand this. I was kind of hoping you were going to be able to help me with this. And then when we removed the outliers, we lost about 6% more data. And those are the numbers that I'm going to use to show you. So we've recorded over 88,000 vehicle visits, and we have visits on 2,600 unique work zones across sites 11 and 2. And you can see how that breaks down. Whoops, there we go. All right, so early analysis based on the data through July 7th, as you could see, again, I'm showing it to you again in the hatched lines above, it looked like there was some very promising data with the alerted group. But when we repeated our analysis all the way through September 16th, including all the data from April 1st to September 16th, we could see that there is what looks like an immediate dip in speed for the alerted vehicles. And then a little later on, they slow down more, but the differences are really small. So if you look here, you can see this is 57 miles an hour, and this is 57.5. We again looked at it looking at means, and again saw this very small reduction. That again, the alerted vehicles are coming in faster, and the control vehicles are taking longer to slow down, but it's subtle. And when we split it out by the two districts, it was even more subtle. So we conducted a mode analysis, again, thinking that perhaps this would get rid of some of the noise. And maybe we're seeing a little less noise. The colors aren't the same as they were in the other one. These are the alerted vehicles. We're seeing a little less noise here than we are in the control vehicles, but it's modest. So then we asked the question, well, maybe it's because we're looking at all vehicles, and we know that the trucks are coming in pretty fast. So what if we divided those trucks that are coming in over 55 miles an hour and those that are coming in under 55 miles an hour? And indeed, you can see that the slope of the alerted vehicles in terms of their reduction in speed shows up more when you just look at the people who are coming in faster. So this made sense to us. If you're already going slower, you don't need to slow down at a work zone. And we were actually showing this. These differences are statistically significant, but I'd point out that we're dealing with just so many vehicles that it's any difference would be statistically significant. So the question is it of practical significance? Does it have any value? I think the jury's out on that. Before June 23rd of 24, all of our alerts said work zone ahead, slow down. But we started thinking, well, maybe we could give more specific data and tell people whether the right lane was closed and the left lane was closed. So we're going to be looking at that to see if more specific data results in more dramatic results. We also looked again at the slopes of the changes in speed for these very specific alerts. So saying left lane closed, right lane closed, or slow down. And it looks like if you are more specific, that the slope is more dramatic when you compared the alerted to the control vehicles, and especially if you look at the vehicles who are going over 55 miles an hour. So for this project, our next step is to fix the glitch and look at the data as it goes out 5 minutes, get more data on whether these specific instructions on whether the lane is closed or not, look more in more detail at another division within California and see, how these things vary geographically. So take a breath and tell you about our next study. So just to keep things spicy, we have a second technology grant from FMCSA, also funded a year ago, also a 2-year grant. This time we're working with a company called AccuSensus, and we have an interesting model, and I'm going to present all of our data from the first year, but hoping to give you more data another time on the second year. So for this study, this uses AI cameras, and you can see here that there are 2 cameras that are watching the cars go past. And because they're using AI, they can capture every single vehicle in lanes 3 and 4, if it's a 4-lane road, or what the first 2 lanes. This is a company that started in Australia, and they also have radar on it to detect speed, and it's solar powered with a backup generator and an onboard CPU. So one of the advantages of using AI is that it can see, in addition to speed, which isn't that difficult to collect, but it collects it on every single vehicle. They can also see in the cab and see if somebody's holding a phone or wearing a seatbelt. Now, in other studies, this technology can be harnessed by law enforcement, where in Australia, where this company is based, they can call ahead to an officer and say, we have a vehicle where the driver's engaged in these unsafe behaviors, and law enforcement can pull them over and confirm it, or whatever their procedure is. We are not doing that. We're about the prevention. And we were the purpose of our study for year 1 was to characterize in the commercial vehicles what the prevalence of these were. The second year of our study, what we're planning to do, and it's already October, so we're engaged in this, we are putting a camera in the same type of location on the side of the road. We're using both freeways and municipal roads. And what we're doing is down the road from there, we're putting up a variable message board. So it turns out that this technology can communicate with a variable message board so quickly that it knows how fast the driver's going. So it knows exactly when the driver's going to hit the variable message board. So it can say, it could say, we're not going to do this. You with license plate so-and-so, put your seatbelt on. We've decided not to do this, but what we are going to do is we're going to put up messages that are very driver specific. We can see you're not wearing your seatbelt. We are still working out exactly what the messages are going to be. Then we're deploying another camera a quarter of a mile down the road or so, and we're going to see, did they actually change their behavior? And we think this is the first time that anybody's actually measured whether behavior change occurred with these signs. We see them all over the freeway, click it or ticket, side of the road, slow down, but we'll be able to measure whether they actually put on their seatbelt. So the data I'm going to quickly show you is the data we got from year one, where we went out to 16 locations and got 168 hours each at each location on state and interstate highways, and 6 locations in unincorporated areas. So from this, we got 160,000 CMVs observed. So the technology allows us to differentiate between passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles, but it's just based on size. It's not more sophisticated than that. However, there is a manual visual checking of all of the infractions. So what did we find? We found almost 11% of the drivers had one offense as they were passing us. And a very small percent had more than one offense. And you can see that the majority of this was cell phones. The majority of this was no seatbelts and speeding, with cell phones being less. What we found was interesting is that this is the line showing how many drivers are on the road, how many vehicles are on the road. And if you look at the infractions and the cell phones in blue, speeding in orange, and seatbelts in green, you can see that for the seatbelts, the infractions went up as the percent of infractions went up as the number of drivers went up on the road. But for speeding, it was the opposite, which kind of makes sense. They're speeding when there's less drivers on the road. And but this was also maybe puzzling or not, that cell phone use was highest. Oh, sorry, this is day of the week. But it still had the same thing, that cell phone use was highest when there were less vehicles on the road. So then we looked at it by time of day. And again, here are the number of vehicles on the road. And then you can see that here's this, from midnight till 4 in the morning. And then from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., something's happening here where people are taking their seatbelts off. Not sure why that's going on. And then seatbelts are coming on. So we're trying to think of how to explain this. Do they think that there's not law enforcement on the road then? Or maybe they're just really tired and they're tired of being in their seats. We don't have the answer to that. I'm just showing you the data. And then the other thing that we found interesting was that these infractions varied quite a bit by where we were collecting the data. So some of our sites were in very southern part of San Diego County, very close to the border, Freeway 905. And we found that the cell phone offenses were higher in the border site versus the non-border site. By contrast, people were most likely to have cell phone offenses in the unincorporated areas. When we looked at whether they were near the reservation, which was only one of our sites, versus not the reservation, this was higher. And for those of you who work with our Native American populations and know what the roads are like near the reservations, we know that crashes are higher and fatalities are higher in those areas. So we also looked at whether it was the far right lane or lane 2, and in the far right lane, we had more cell phone infractions. So here are some of my last slides looking at the total number of offenders by type, and you can see how that divides out the cell phone, the speeding, the no seatbelts, and then the very small number of people who were not wearing their seatbelt and holding a phone. So one thing I'll point out about this is that 56% of all of the CMVs were traveling over the posted speed limit, which is generally 55 in California. We chose to only look at over 65 at speeding for the analysis I'm showing you, just so that we could try to see how the patterns were for the worst offenders. But we will go into more detail as we dig into this data more and say, what about, is it the over 60? Who are these people? They're already driving fast. Now they're driving faster. What are their characteristics? We also looked at, on the rural road leading to the reservation, 33% of the CMVs committed some sort of offense, which is 3 times higher than the 10% that I told you about. So this is our experimental setup, another visual for you to see what we're going to do this coming year. Again, we're going to work across these types of roads. The challenge that we're finding, and again, I said it's messy to work with the companies that weren't necessarily set up for doing research. What's also challenging is getting the permits and permission to set up this kind of equipment on the roadside. Caltrans has been very helpful, but there's a lot of rules. You have to put up just many, many feet of K-rail in front of these kinds of devices and get permits well ahead of time. So in the unincorporated areas, we've had to go out and get permission from the community to put this equipment up there. We're always very careful to put on our, we call this Wally. We're careful to put a sign on Wally saying that, it's a research study and we're not using it for enforcement. So, as I mentioned, I have a big, wonderful team. And as everybody in this room knows, public health is team science, and you can't do it without all of these wonderful people. And it turns out that we couldn't do it without our partners at Caltrans and FMCSA and the county and California Highway Patrol, who's also been very helpful in helping us set up, and our 2 partners, AccuSensus and DriveWise. So that's my story. I will end by saying that we were funded by Safe Streets for All to replicate this with passenger vehicles. And so we're doing almost the exact study with a little bit more runway time to see what happens with the non-CMV driver. All right.
So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll just run to you so that our Zoom audience can hear your questions. And while you think about your questions, let me start with one. For your DriveWise study, Linda, I was very interested in getting a sense from you about more kind of safe systems variables that could be potentially interacting with the intervention to produce better results or results that are more aligned with your expectations. For example, hours driven. So thinking about hours of service regulations and hours of driving or pay rate.
Yeah.
If we know the drivers are paid by the mile versus by the hour, if they're truckload versus less than truckload.
I like that.
Other variables that you've maybe thought of that potentially you could interact with the intervention in your analysis?
Yeah, I don't know that we'll be able to do that. So, the data that's being pushed to us right now doesn't include that. One of the things we are looking at, as I said, there's many different types of work zones. And right now, the data I showed you is all kinds of work zones. And some of them are minor and some of them are major. So I think one of the reasons we may not be seeing a big effect is that it's being washed out by very minor work zones where the trucks don't feel that they have to slow down. But we will be able to break that out. My wonderful team stopped the data analysis on September 16th just so that we would have clean data for you for this presentation. But there's so much more that we want to do in terms of trying to understand when this works and when this doesn't. I do love your idea, and I can go back to DriveWise and see if there's a way of including any of that.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your question, for your presentation. For the first study, I was curious why alerted truck drivers seem to be driving more right before they got alerted. Is that because that they knew that they were an alerted truck driver and maybe could be a little bit more risky?
You mean their speed went up?
Their speed was going up.
Yeah, we noticed that. We were thinking, again, we are, I don't think I mentioned this, but we're going out with a survey to the drivers to see how they're feeling about it now that we're kind of halfway through the study. That they may not be a driver who's gotten an alert. We're pushing it out through the fleets, but we've pushed out so many alerts. I think some of them will be, and they get other alerts. So we wondered if they get an alert that there's something ahead, and then they're thinking, oh, I'm going to have to slow down. And they're subconsciously like, the data looks really dramatic, but that's only a second, and it's only a really small amount of increase in speed. So their subconscious, before they've even registered, goes, oh, I'm going to have to slow down ahead. Oh, I'm not going to take my foot off the accelerator yet. This is one of the things we hypothesized, but well, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
First, thank you. I mean, it's super interesting. And yeah, I mean, the first study, I had two questions, but they may both be irrelevant based on how you collected data or how you pushed out the alert. So the first question is, did all construction zones or work zones, did they get the alert for every work zone in the Caltrans database? So they can't be their own control. That's
right.
Yeah. So that was, I was wondering, because that difference between the, like the number, it's like, that's so fascinating.
Yes. We're working with DriveWise to make sure that the identification of alerted drivers is, and the controlled drivers is really truly random. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Agree.
Right. And then the other question is with regard to the so the process of getting the alert and how they're responding to it. So I mean, I thought it was really clever how you broke it out by the different speed limit, the speed groups. I was kind of wondering if the repeats happening. So because these truckers are driving, or the commercial vehicles are driving similar routes, I would imagine, are they getting repeat alerts for the same work zone? Mm-hmm. Do we know that in the data?
All I can report to you is vehicles. Unlike my AccuSensus study, where AccuSensus actually knows who the vehicle is, DriveWise they just geofence the work zones, and participating trucks will get an alert as they go through that geofence. There's almost certainly a percentage of drivers who are going through those. We might be able to break some of that out by looking at the length of the truck. Again, a future analysis, and looking at the really big trucks are probably more likely in going on a longer journey and less likely to be just back and forth across the same geofence compared to the shorter ones. So if we saw some kind of either heightened awareness or just fatigue with the shorter ones, I'm not sure which way it would go.
Yeah. I don't know.
Right?
It's such interesting work. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing it.
Oh, thanks.
There's another question.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question is, so what's the magnitude of the problem? Like, what percent of the commercial motor vehicle crashes are these work zone crashes? Would you have an idea?
So I guess I can go back to my beginning slides and say what we know is that I don't think I can answer your question exactly the way you asked it. So I'll do what most speakers do, which is they change the answer to match what they know. So what I do know is that the large trucks are overrepresented in fatal crashes in work zones. And I don't think I have the answer. Here's the answer of how many CMV fatal work zone crashes in black and the percent of CMV involvement in fatal work zone crashes. But that's, again, not exactly answering your question of what percent of all CMV crashes are occurring at work zones. But if you come up afterwards, I'll try to get you that answer. I would be happy to send it to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. So I feel like I've seen a lot of presentations at conferences recently on vehicle technology. And so this was an interesting sort of different approach, because it seems like a lot of what's been done now is applying technology to sort of prevent the behaviors or sort of take over for the human to prevent them from doing these, unsafe behaviors. And I sort of wonder how you think these all fit together.
How they all fit together as
well, to address these traffic safety problems, because there's these advanced driver assistance systems, and
right.
Obviously, it takes a certain amount of time for those to be adopted, for the fleet to roll over, right, or for new technology to be installed. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it takes a multifaceted approach. We just have such an unacceptably high rate of fatalities. So I think it's this multifaceted approach where you're working with one of the advantages of working with commercial drivers is that they report often, not necessarily completely, but they report to fleets. So when you collect some data about the fleets, if for example, as we had discussed, there are a number of apps out there that monitor the truck drivers and then report back to the fleets, and the fleet managers can provide them counseling. So I think that's one avenue, is to use the technology to get counseling and feedback to the driver. We have a shortage of drivers. We don't want them to lose their jobs. We really want it to be about prevention. We want them to not get in crashes. They're dangerous. They're just huge weapons on the road. So trying to approach it where you're giving driver feedback on the spot without distracting them, and then you're trying to give them feedback on the side of the road. Again, we're trying to figure out how to do that. You're trying to work with the fleet managers. And the other thing we didn't talk about is impairment in commercial motor vehicle drivers. And with the opening up of cannabis legalization in so many states, the drivers are thinking that they can use cannabis as they use alcohol, perhaps, but they have regular drug testing that gets reported to the Central Clearinghouse. And this, again, is creating a shortage of drivers, because drivers who aren't perhaps used well ahead of time were not impaired at the time that they drove, but their THC showed up in their system, then they're either have to go into rehab or they lose their jobs, and the fleet has to be willing to put that kind of work into. So speaking of cannabis, I know we're out of time. I'll end by saying that when I was invited to give the talk, I proposed that we could also talk about the work that we've done on cannabis and driving. So there is a whole nother body of work that we've been doing in looking at this problem of the attitudes of drivers who are using cannabis and getting on the road and thinking that they're not impaired. And it's a very highly prevalent behavior. So, for another day.
Well, please join me in thanking Linda for a great presentation.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yes, a very, very timely topic, and a topic that is connected to the heart of the economy, since so much freight moves by truck, as you pointed out, and also a major occupational health issue, right? So these drivers go through a lot of challenges.
Yes.
And this is reflected in exactly what you're showing us today. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us in person, online, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.